we will go ahead and get started.
Thank you, Carrie. Yeah, so I am tasked with introducing a little background here to answer the question of why we are all gathered here and what we're doing and how that is funded and what is important about it. And many of you will have heard this before, but first I just want to say thank you everyone for showing up. It's actually kind of quite pleasant to all be together tonight. And I start with this image because I want us to kind of have this vision as we go through this webinar of the fact that we're talking about the watershed as a whole, the Rio de Flag watershed. So to kind of get that visually in our minds as we're going forward. Next slide, please. And so the Friends of the Rio de Flag envisioned that a Rio de Flag watershed plan would be a very valuable thing to bring together and approach the Bureau of Reclamation, or actually applied to the Bureau of Reclamation to their Water Smart grant program, and succeeded in being awarded a grant, which is actually phase one of a two-phase grant setup that they have. The first grant is really intended to create an expanded watershed stakeholder group. So building on the various interests who are involved in the Friends of the Rio de Flag already, expanding that out. And that has been part of what we've been doing in the lead up to these public presentations. And that group has named itself the Watershed Alliance for the Rio de Flag. And then have the Watershed Alliance for the Rio de Flag engaged to develop this very alive, community-based watershed plan and collaborate together to undertake the priority projects that we identify through this planning process, be able to evaluate the success of those projects and adaptively manage the plan or adapt the plan going forward to continue to reach the goals for the watershed that we've come up with together. So each of these Explore the Watershed Zoom meetings gives the opportunity for folks from general public and interest to provide input both during and after the Zoom meeting. So we're doing that through interactive map-based surveys. And why that is so important, not only does the Watershed Water Smart grant program recognize the need for community-based planning and implementation of watershed work, but also it is a place where we can convene and come together to work on problems that are complex, comprehensive, where there's this interface of the social and the ecological, and be forward-looking so that we can coordinate all of these sort of disparate efforts that are going on in the watershed, bring them together and move forward for hopefully a long time to come. So I will leave it at that and hand off to Carrie to introduce our speakers and get rolling.
And I'm on mute. So I know that many of you have joined us before, and at this point, I think all of us are pretty familiar with Zoom, but I'm going to go through a couple of Zoom tips real quick. You guys are, I'm sure, very familiar with how to mute yourself, how to unmute yourself. We are working today to have some breakout group opportunities. So that's the really critical part, to make sure you're off mute. While you're watching presentations, obviously put yourself on mute. Enjoy a snack or dinner or what have you. But when we're in breakout groups, that's when we really want the robust conversation. Also, video on, we'd love to see your faces. So if you can turn your videos on, have the capability and are willing to do so, we would love to see you. Please, as we're going through the presentations tonight, if you have questions specific to presenters or content on the slides, please use the chat function. It's worked really well in the past. We really enjoy having robust conversation that way as well. And then presenters can look at the chat after they're done presenting and get back to people with specific answers to questions. Also, raising your hand. Zoom has just changed their settings, so raising your hand is a little bit easier. If you go down to reactions at the bottom of your screen, you can raise your hand, and that makes it a little bit easier than prior. Also, when we're not presenting, we're not sharing screens, if you want to look at the grid view, that way you can see all of everyone's faces and see who is joining us tonight. Likewise, just as per standard meeting, use etiquette. We're going to try. I know it's hard in Zoom to know when someone's about to say something, but we're just going to go ahead and try and do our best to do that. So for tonight, the agenda for this evening is we are well into the Zoom orientation and the introductory remarks. We will have panel presentations from Alan Hayden from Natural Channel Design, Abe Springer from NAU, and Danielle Perry from NAU and Friends of the Rio de Flag. We will have a short break. We're going to have a full group discussion surrounding metrics on how do we measure watershed health and how do we come up with metrics and how do we determine success on those. After that, we're going to do a small group breakouts where we're going to have some mapping opportunities to have people really help us figure out where to put points on a map where we're talking about rehabilitation efforts, within the watershed. So that's the plan for this evening. We adjourn at 7. We always keep the Zoom open until 7:15 because we don't want to cut people off if we're having good conversation. Feel free to leave at 7 if you'd like, or feel free to stay till 7:15 if you want to chat. We encourage that. So I'm going to stop sharing right now. And I'm going to, we always like to start these meetings with a little question about, we like to gauge kind of what we want to know from folks. So the first 3 sessions, we asked people, where do they live? What neighborhood do you live in? But today we are changing it up. And see if I can get the link. All right, I'm putting a link in the chat box. If everyone can please click on the link and let us know. I know that everyone has lots of interests within the watershed, but we are asking you to indicate what best describes your interest in the watershed. You can only get to pick one, so please read through your options and pick the one that best describes your interest, and then I will show you the results as they come in. So the cool thing about this app, it's called Mentimeter. It's kind of a live survey. So we're getting to see as more people answer, those little sections of this donut get bigger or smaller. So I see we're up to 21 people have responded, which is great. Thank you all for your participation. I'm gonna leave it open for a little bit longer to see where we're headed, but it looks like, can't say I'm too surprised to see that the majority of the interest is surrounding natural science. And natural science, as we all know, is a huge topic. But I'm happy to see that there's a little bit everywhere, ranging from community awareness and education, which is awesome. We had a great session on that. That was our second session. And we have another one coming up on the 20th that's called Rio for the People. So that's another way to get involved through education and awareness. So that's great. All right. And these final results, when they're all done, will be put into the notes from the meeting. And so these will be able to be viewed, by the public. All right. And with that, and I guess I should let everyone know, I just kind of assume that people know who we are. but that there's a good chance that you don't. My name is Carrie Eberly. I work for Southwest Decision Resources. My colleague, Lisa Clark, who is up in my upper left-hand corner of my screen, she's waving. We are here to help facilitate this process, the community input, stakeholder engagement through the BOR WaterSmart grant. We were brought on contract through that, and we are happy to be here. It feels great to see some really familiar faces tonight, people who have been with us through the long haul. So this is the number 4 out of a series of 6. And we're gonna go ahead and get started here with our presentation. We're gonna kick it off with Mr. Alan Hayden from Natural Channel Design. And why don't you go ahead, Alan? I'm gonna put myself on mute.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Alan Hayden. I work for Natural Channel Design, and I am also a member of the board of directors for the Friends of the Rio de Flag. And then I was asked to come and talk to you guys about hydrology of the Rio de Flag, of which I am not an expert. I do have some ideas, and because I do a lot of restoration work in the area, we have to use hydrology, and so I have some clue. But if you were expecting a talk from an expert, you should probably listen to Abe or one of the 10 or 12 other real hydrologists that are on the Zoom call this evening. So next slide, please, Karen. So just a little bit about the watershed. Once we get down past the city of Flagstaff, it's fairly large, about 111 square miles. We've got several different sub-watersheds of various sizes, which lead into that. And interestingly enough, they all kind of enter and join the Rio de Flag right in our city limits. And so the city of Flagstaff and its policies and the way we live here can have a really big effect on a lot of things that go on downstream. Some of the quick aspects of that: we are dominated by ponderosa pine forest. We've got a really strong elevational gradient from the peaks all the way down to town here. And we are fairly deep, porous volcanic soils and underlain by limestone. So we can soak up a lot of water and put it into the ground here. Precipitation is generally bimodal. We have snow melt and monsoon runoff events. And as most people who live here, you recognize that. Next slide. So generally, this is an ephemeral drainage, meaning we only see flows in response to storm flow. However, I thought it was surprising to me in some aspects. We did a Friends of the Rio de Flag sponsored a wet-dry mapping several years ago in 2018. This was conducted during a very dry period of a relatively dry year. And the wet-dry mapping showed that about, roughly 1/3 of the reach that we studied, the 19-mile reach, had perennial, or likely had perennial flow. We found water on, during May in a dry season, usually the dry season of the year. Those wet areas are sporadic throughout the drainage, and you'll notice there's some places we couldn't get to because of private land, but they are sourced from both natural sources such as springs. Not all the springs are included here, but also from human-created sources. We release reclaimed water into the Rio de Flag in several different places, both from the I-40 wetlands, right at the bottom of the map there, and out at Picture Canyon as well. And many thanks to the many volunteers that helped put this together on a weekend. And we hope to do it again real soon if we can get volunteers again. So next slide, please. And I throw this in because I just want to make the note that we do have the potential to alter these ephemeral reaches into perennial reaches. And this is kind of highlighted by a study that Natural Channel Design helped kind of guide along and participate with, sponsored by the City of Flagstaff Water Services. And the City of Flagstaff wanted to look at the feasibility of recharging our aquifer, where we draw our drinking water, and using reclaimed water to recharge that aquifer. So these are just some preliminary results. We looked at 4 different reaches: Bow and Arrow, the Rio de Flag, Sinclair Wash, and Schweitzer Wash. And the test consisted of releasing 500 gallons a minute or 1,000 gallons per minute as a steady flow through these reaches, and measuring where we lost water into the ground and where we lost flow. Usually the 500 to 1,000 gallon was lost into the channel, generally within a mile, sometimes a mile and a half, depending upon where we are in the watershed and what the soil conditions are underneath. So, you know, while they're preliminary, it is apparent that it's going to be feasible that we can use these, you know, natural stream systems to help put water into the ground. We have a lot more work to do to figure out where that water goes, what its ultimate fate is, and whether we're doing good with it. But because we think this release method is feasible, we have the potential to enhance the riparian and aquatic resources that are associated with these channels as well, meaning that we can do a picture canyon type restoration where we could change an ephemeral channel into a perennial one and all the resources that go with that. So next slide, please. So what about stormwater runoff? We talked about the low base flows, but the stormwater runoffs are what we remember as floods, and also is what is responsible for forming the channels and making the landforms around us. So the watershed that we live in is a complacent watershed. And if you want to know more about complacency, you can read the papers on the bottom with Hawkins and Hill and those guys. But complacency means that we have a big watershed, we get a fair amount of precipitation on it, and it yields very, very little water relative to other watersheds. We don't get much runoff. And if you look over here on the right at this graph, which shows, you know, watershed size across the bottom, and shows discharge, and then the recurrence interval of those discharges, the 1.5 year, the 2 year, the 5 year, those things down there, you'll notice that our watersheds in this region are pretty darn big and release very, very little water. Until we get up into the very large, infrequent events. And that's when they say that a complacent watershed goes violent. And so the watershed yield is related to these really a lot of forest, a lot of deep, porous soils, and a lot of cracks in the limestone, which can soak up a lot of water as well. And there also continues to these landforms that are not conducive to quick draining. And if you look down over on the bottom left of that slide, this is some data from our friends at J. Fuller. This is a result of the museum fire. They did some modeling, but it's pretty telling. You can see that water coming out of Schweitzer Canyon Wash down into town, it comes out as a consolidated flow, and then it splits off into many different directions as it goes across one of these large alluvial fans, that surround the San Francisco peaks. When it splits off, it diverts water out into various areas where it goes at a much slower pace and has the ability to percolate into these deep soils. It's not carried in a confined channel for very far. So all of these things kind of coalesce together and form this kind of complacent function of our watersheds. When we are capable of turning loose a lot of water, generally under really special conditions, that we have, you know, snow melt that's frozen ground, and we can yield a lot in those porous soils, and the deep forest doesn't really help us very much at that point. So at that point, the watershed can become violent. So we're looking at a situation where normally we see very little flow, discharge coming out of these watersheds until we get to a certain point, and then a lot comes out. And that means a lot for our flood control in town, and also a lot for the size and kind of types of channels that we have around town. We can go to the next slide if you don't mind, Carrie. So what does this mean for geomorphology? And what does it mean for the channels that we look at and their function around? And what does it mean for disturbances to our watersheds? So under normal conditions, the regions back in our region, our active channels are very, very small. And if you look at this graph here, it's a graph of watershed size along the x-axis and cross-sectional area of the active or bank-full channel. And the red line is a regional curve that's developed by Tom Moody and others, that's kind of representative of most of the state. So if you have a 1 square mile watershed, you're going to have around a little over 12 square feet of cross-sectional area in a channel. And these are pretty reliable relationships, but they're sub-regional, meaning that we can see differences around the state. One is the solid blue line, which is the Arizona White Mountains and Western New Mexico. But I want to call your attention to these blue squares down here. And these are regional watersheds within our, these are Schweitzer Wash, Bow and Arrow Wash, these kind of things that are in our region and form the Rio de Flag watershed. And you'll notice that these channels are really, really small compared to channels around the rest of the state. And this is a log scale. So we're looking at orders of magnitude smaller than what we would expect in the rest of the state. And this is a response to that complacent watershed, complacent yield. Okay, we have a little bit of runoff, and the channels are accordingly small. But we can see really big changes. So forest fire, and urbanization both affect that complacent quality of our watersheds. With fires, the soils become not porous, they become very hydrophobic and are able to shed almost all of their water. And urbanization has very similar effect. When we pave over things or put roofs on things, well, that all runs off really quickly as well. And so what I want to show you is that, like, unlike these little blue squares down here on the bottom, if we have a fire, and this, again, these are the same watersheds from around the San Francisco Peaks area, these little red crosses. Oh, lost you there. Okay, the little red crosses are cross-sectional areas of channels that we've looked at after fire. And these can be 1 or 2 years after a fire, and some of them are out to 50 years after a fire. And so you can see that we've seen the channels change hugely in response to a forest fire burn. likewise, if you look at these kind of green diamonds here through here and here, these are watersheds below town, okay? The ones that are above the curve here are ones that are greatly affected by urbanizations. The ones out here, not so much, okay? So once we start having urbanization, we increase the size of our channels. And once we have forest fires, we increase the size of the channels. And please do keep in mind, this is a log scale. So we are changing the channels by an order of magnitude during these events. And that has really large consequences for sediment, because as the channel enlarges, it carves itself out and creates a sediment issue for all of our streams. And Ed was asking about Mogollon Rim streams, and Mogollon Rim streams are actually up here on this red line, and most of the ones that we've studied are right on the central Arizona and southern regional curve, dead on it, and are easily predicted. So, so a little bit of, we have our unique hydrology, which leads us to unique channel sizes. And we're finding that the reasons for that hydrology are really sensitive to changes in the watershed. And we need to pay attention to that. And we can go to the next slide. So what does this mean? So our watershed is providing some really valuable and rather unique resources and services. And those services and resources are easily perturbed. And there's a need for us to kind of keep that in mind, what services are being provided to us, and provide some protection to those very cool things. Those alluvial fans that surround town are really, really unique and really important to the way that we live here in town. And if you have any questions about it, you can ask people that live below the Schultz fire or live below the museum fire as to what the effects could be. We think about what channels and what streams require around here, where there's a need for really small active channels, but very large floodplains or space for those very active kind of violent runoff events to fit themselves through. So Flagstaff and the Rio de Flag are in the midst of a pretty active period of hydrologic and geomorphic change. All of the points that I showed you on that last graph, you know, all those fires have occurred in my lifetime, and I am not that old, despite what a lot of people say. So those things are happening. They're happening right now, and we need to be cognizant of those as we think about how we want to enhance our watershed and live better with it. And then also our water use and treatment methods and all that, it has to be a consideration in our watershed treatments as well. So that is what I have for you, and hopefully it gives you some things to think about. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Alan. And these are things for us to think about as we move into the discussion after the speakers. So appreciate that. There's additional question for you, Alan, if you want to reply to everyone. There was a question about wildfires in the chat stream. Thank you. And we're going to go ahead and move to Abe Springer now from NAU. Abe, go ahead and take it away.
All right, thanks, Carrie. And you can go to the first slide. And I'll apologize to all of you up front. I spent a long time preparing these slides. This morning I got up and I went for a lovely 7-mile run out Sinclair Wash and the Loop Trail and around Soldiers Trail. And I decided to junk all these slides today. I'm going to give you some comments that aren't easy, and I'm not taking them very lightly, what I want to share with you tonight. but they're based on my over 25 years of professional experience in Northern Arizona. And the take-home message I want to leave with you is my serious concerns, and it's for a pointed discussion, that a lot of our current forest restoration practices in this region are a complete failure for the springs, the streams, the wet meadows, and other dependent aquatic ecosystems that they're designed to support. And I want to do that, back up to the previous slide for a second, Carrie, with some examples. Mostly my experience is in the Sinclair Wash piece of the watershed. I know it like the back of my hand. I've got a lot of experience in Hart Prairie, over 25 years. That's the flume on the left. And then the picture on the middle is one of the features Alan was talking about. If you've never seen the bottomless pits, this is 2005, when it was accepting up to 40 cubic feet per second of recharge during a snowmelt event. You can hit the next slide now, Carrie. And this bottom right picture is intentional. That's Sinclair Wash at University Heights Drive South under a snowmelt event. And I don't know how many of you have been on the urban trail between Flagstaff and Fort Tuthill the last 6 months, but there's a sewer line essentially is going up the Rio de Flag channel that has essentially no oversight and management of sediment yield. The only thing that's protected the Rio de Flag in the system this year has been our drought. So one of my concerns and a solution I want to recommend is that there is a lack of oversight of a lot of the actions that are being done in our area. And I want to recommend that there needs to be more funding put into continuous assessment and oversight. And I'll talk about metrics here in a moment. And I think it's even become such a problem for a lot of these projects that there needs to be a nonpartisan, independent oversight and advisory group that evaluates the response and actions taken on watershed restoration. You can flip ahead a few more slides here, Carrie. I was going to go to Hawksworth. Go another slide. You guys these will be posted later. You're welcome to take a look at them at your leisure. But Hawksworth Springs is in Upper Lake Mary. It's an area that's receiving a shelf stock treatment of Fort Fry right now. Another slide, Carrie. And one more. These slides in background, keep going, yeah, are to look at the role, another one. But Hawksworth is an area, and one more, is an area designed, it's an important spring, it's an upland, one more. There it is. This is backup one, yeah. This picture on the left is a picture in August of 2018, right after a contractor bladed a road through a wet meadow that received over $500,000 of restoration work in partnership between a lot of partners and stakeholders. This project, some of you know about or read about. I don't know if you've been out here to photograph it since then, Tom, but it was really heartbreaking to see what happened out there, just from a clear lack of communication, implementation, and oversight. I'm not sure that implementation has improved from these projects since then. This road was bladed within 10 feet of the spring and with other pieces of the channel. There were no resources available to mitigate it. The NGO had to go out and put up a couple silt fences. There was no compensation sought or liability from the contractor who did the work. And I could go on and on with examples of this. I just gave you two from Sinclair Wash and one from Hawksworth Springs. But I think that to move forward with watershed restoration work, planning is great, but I think we spend way too much time on planning and not enough time on assessing what the actions are and having adequate oversight for the problems that frequently happen. Our most notorious problem is the Flagstaff Watershed Protection Program actually caused a fire to cause significant damage and harm to the area it was designed to protect. So I'm just going to say one last thing, and I'll turn it over to Danielle. There are some metrics that exist. That's what's on this slide. Some of these you're aware of. Some of them Danielle and I just learned about from our grad class this spring. On the upper right, the Forest Service has a watershed condition classification system, which is a qualitative tool that the watershed specialists of forest units do on different watersheds. I've just got a snapshot of the condition class for the upper Rio de Flag watershed here, which is listed at functioning at risk by the experts on its current condition. The other tool that the Forest Service has is that middle one. There is a best management practice evaluation and rating program by the Forest Service, but for both of these Forest Service programs, there's no tools to have any oversight or management changes because of these. And then for springs, some of you are probably more familiar with this, is an assessment tool Larry and I developed. If you go to Spring Stewardship Institute assessment, this that I pulled up here is the assessment actually for Big LaRue Spring, just to give you a sense of a tool that exists there. But for these assessment tools and metrics, there's no funding for them. Larry and I, all this work we're showing you here is largely done pro bono and volunteer. Hawksworth Springs has been my hobby site for 25 years of my career. There's no dedicated funding from the Forest Service to manage and maintain it. They have to rely on Friends of the Forest to go out and manage the fence out there. There's no resources to do that work. So I'll get off my soapbox, and Danielle's going to pitch some other solutions to you.
Well, thank you, Abe. And sometimes it's nice to have someone just throw all their hard work and prep on PowerPoint slides to the wind to bring up pressing issues. So I appreciate that. And I think everyone appreciates your passion for this. And I'm sure we will have some good discussion on potential metrics after Danielle's presentation. So with that, Danielle, I'm gonna kick it over to you.
Great, thanks. And you can just move on to the next slide. So I'm Danielle Perry. I'm a water resource geographer in the School of Earth and Sustainability here at NAU. And I'm relatively new to Flagstaff. I've been here since the summer of 2017. But I've been learning a lot about the watershed from research at school and also serving on the board of directors of the Friends of the Rio de Flag. So my area of expertise, my research agenda examines water conservation and restoration policies that focus on riverine ecosystems and the services that they provide to society, like fresh water. My work really tries to reframe existing policies to use them as solutions for current and future environmental problems. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about some of those reframing or reconsideration of policies that already exist at the federal, state, and local level. Locally, I've worked in the watershed, particularly on issues pertaining to the protection of sacred sites in the Little Colorado River confluence area, and how water exploitation upstream in this area poses a threat to those sites and upstream in the rest of the Little Colorado River. So it's really important to remember that the Rio de Flag is a tributary to the Little Colorado, and whatever happens here affects the availability of water downstream for our indigenous neighbors, and both through the river channels and through groundwater availability. So I just want to make that point. So next slide. Oh no, actually you can see here some images of the work that I do at NAU, teaching the current and future generations about water in this region. And most of my knowledge of the watershed is actually by taking students into the field and my kids. And you can see these two center pictures here. One is my little ones on top of a sewer drainage system in Schweitzer Creek, which is near our home. And then my other little wild animal in the reeds over at Francis Short Pond. And then the other is groups of students at Lake Mary. And I see that Brian Hunsinger is here on the talk or on this panel, and he is very welcoming every year to hundreds of students in my classes to come out and tour the Lake Merriwater treatment facility. And so these types of activities really help to connect the university community with the greater Flagstaff community. And I think that's a really important aspect when we think about watershed health and all of the people who have some sort of influence in what's going to happen here now and in the future. Okay, next slide. So Alan talked a little bit about ecosystem services, or the services that nature provides to society and the benefits that we reap from those services that are available freely. And in talking about watershed health of the Rio de Flag, what we're really talking about is trying to protect and restore those services. And so some of the services that this river provides is obviously wildlife habitat. That second picture over from the left, I took the other day in Schweitzer Creek. That creek provides a migration corridor for terrestrial species all year long. There's a buck and a doe deer there in that picture, and they migrate up and down that creek every day. The watershed also provides pollination potential for migratory species like the monarch butterfly that flies through here every year. This is a migratory pathway for them. It recharges groundwater, which is one of the major topics that we discuss. But having intact riparian areas and floodplains also helps to mitigate floods and droughts. So protecting those open spaces is incredibly important when we're talking about trying to contend with the threats of greater intensity of floods and droughts in the future. The wide open spaces provide view sheds, which ultimately can be used for recreation and a sense of well-being, which a lot of literature shows that when people talk about which ecosystem services are the most important to them, the sense of well-being that they derive from being out in nature is actually the most important one. And I would argue that a lot of people live in Flagstaff specifically for that region. So next slide, please. So what are some of the policies that are influencing the watershed health? Well, these two images here, you can see that we have a variegated or very diverse type of land ownership here. The Forest Service is the largest owner or caretaker of land in the area, followed by private lands in the region. And then the rest of the lands are divvied up between the military, national parks, the city of Flagstaff, and state trust lands. And that's really important when we think about, you know, what is affecting our water? What is affecting the river? A major impact is the fact that the size of the community has nearly doubled in the last decade. And it continues to grow at a really fast pace. And that's putting a lot of pressure both on the land and water resources. So what kind of policies exist that are trying to improve the watershed health? Well, many of you are probably aware that in 2012, the community voted to approve a $10 million bond to support the Flagstaff Watershed Protection Project. And those of you who don't know, this project is a partnership effort between local and state stakeholders and also the National Forest to build watershed resilience to fires and to post-fire flooding. So the project has involved these treatments that we've been talking about tree thinning, prescribed fire, even helicopter and cable logging. But beyond this project, there's no federal policies that specifically protect the Rio de Flag watershed for either its ecological or hydrological processes. And this is particularly salient, important fact given the recent rulings on the Clean Water Act that stripped all ephemeral streams of any protections under the Clean Water Act, right? So if we're thinking about how we're going to protect and restore our Rio de Flag, which is ephemeral, and the fact that it exists, it flows through both private and public land. And there is a history of really developing this land and transforming the river in various places. We need to find policies that work in very localized areas, because the likelihood of finding policies that are going to really protect the entire river and watershed are unlikely. So what I'm going to do next in the next slide is present a few creative policy solutions for the protection of key locations in the watershed. But before I go on, I have to give credit to 3 grad students who were in the class that Abe and I co-taught last semester for doing a deep dive into the literature to find these policy solutions. Okay, so Zoe Klein, Leah Marshall, and Joseph Thomas, thanks a lot. They did most of the research that I'm about to present in these next few slides. So you can go to the next slide, please. The first one is thinking about the federal level. And at the federal level, you saw that Coconino National Forest is the largest landowner or land manager in the area. They're federal lands, they're public lands, they're our lands really, but they're tasked with managing them. And so some of the types of designations that the Forest Service has come up with are to protect special areas are research natural areas, botanical areas, and geologic areas. And a research natural area, or an RNA, is designated to protect specific ecological features by limiting development and high impact use by humans. They also function as a baseline study area for measuring long-term ecological changes. And currently in Coconino National Forest, there are 4 established RNAs. There are 2 proposed RNAs. There are also 2 botanical areas and 2 geological areas in the forest, but none of them are protecting any of the headwaters of the Rio de Flag. So it's important to note that new areas can be proposed in a forest plan or recommended by designation by the forest. And once they're proposed, they have to go through analysis and then get approved. But when they get approved, it affords them these levels of protection. And so the research that these students did actually identified 2 key places that they recommend get protected. One is LaRue Springs in the upper left-hand corner of that map, and the other is the South Campbell Mesa area. Both of these are headwater streams that feed the Rio de Flag. They're really unique places that are hydrologically significant. The sites would be useful also for monitoring and measuring any long-term changes that might happen in the watershed. So useful for understanding what's happening elsewhere in the watershed. It's also possible that an RNA designation, even if it doesn't, once it's proposed, it receives a certain level of protection until a decision can be made on it. So just recommending it for protection can afford some interim protections until other types of decisions could be made about these areas within the watershed. So next slide, please. That's at the federal level. At the state level, there's opportunities to coordinate with other nonprofits like, let's see, Friends of the Verde, the Nature Conservancy, Central Arizona Conservation Alliance, the Sonoran Institute, to advocate for a long-term stewardship clause to be incorporated into the framework that governs state trust lands. So state trust lands were granted to all of the states in the union to be used for economic purposes, essentially, for development. And there are regulations around how they can be used. There are very few state policies that actually protect open space, but state trust lands provide one path for open space protections. Generally, these state trust lands, as you can see here in this map, occur in a checkerboard pattern. So those green squares there that are circled in the lower part of our watershed. And you'll notice that those green squares actually abut quite a bit of the stream channel. And so they're pretty vital for the health of the watershed. Protecting those particular pieces of land will be pretty important. So one way to do this would be, as I said, advocate for some sort of long-term stewardship clause that could go into the governing framework for these lands. And it would be centered around the idea of ecosystem service benefits from open space designations. Some options for enhancing ecosystem services include mitigation and conservation banking, quantifying non-monetary returns, and establishing conservation leasing programs, keeping in mind that mitigation and conservation banking is already possible through the Clean Water Act and the Endangered Species Act regulatory framework. So there's frameworks that exist there that could be used to advocate for this at the state level. So the banking options would involve conserving lands within trust lands, state trust lands, and to sell credits to other organizations or individuals in the area who are developing land. So kind of a swap there. Non-monetary returns can help place the focus on long-term stewardship. And we're already seeing this happen in other states like Colorado. They have implemented this type of creative solution to incorporating conservation-based management by shifting an emphasis away from high revenue developments on trust lands to emphasizing that long-term stewardship of these lands. Okay, next slide, please. And then at the local level, the city level, the city of Flagstaff has a comprehensive, has developed this comprehensive and community invested program to preserve and protect open space within the city limits. And the open space program, which was founded in '98, has incorporated today over 5,500 acres of land, including Picture Canyon that you see here. The primary goals of the open space program is to maintain, enhance, and restore environmentally, culturally, and recreationally important lands. To accomplish the goals, the program pursues a whole bunch of methods of acquiring land, including through conservation easements, land purchases, financing for conservation, purchase of development rights, transfer of development rights, zoning, and incorporation of land into, all for the point of incorporating lands into the conservation land system. So this particular idea here revolves around the idea of transferring development rights to increase preservation of open space in the city. So Arizona state law does permit the transfer or permission of development or purchase of development rights during the approval process for increased occupancy on any given parcel. Similar to other rights that a landowner has, like having possession or using, modifying, selling their land, they also have this bundle of development rights. So the rights can be transferred from one piece of land to another. Once a development right is sent to another parcel, the sending parcel can no longer be built on and must be preserved and used only for open space, farming, or forestry. Those are the stipulations within the state. So these types of transfers lead to increasing that open space conservation land. The transfers really can yield some tangible benefits for all the residents because it still allows for increased growth and development, but it also provides for the protection of recreation spaces, view sheds, and reducing concentrations of development within the city limits in areas that are really of ecological importance. Okay, so those are some creative policy solutions. Perhaps you're familiar with some of those. We're going to completely switch gears now to the next slide. And we're going to talk about something that we all think about a lot here in Flagstaff, and that's wastewater reuse. Abe, I'm going to call on you when I'm done to just talk about a little bit of what you had in those slides to follow up on what I'm mentioning here. So most people in the United States in municipalities are spoiled. We get to go to the tap, turn it on, and get water that's treated to standards to keep us safe from organic and inorganic contaminants. It's clear. You turn it on, it just runs. Most people, right, in cities. We have Clean Water Act regulations that are mandated by the federal government that set limits on the amount of contaminants that could harm us through potable water consumption. However, there's still a lot of uncertainty about how the cocktails made up of household cleaning products, pharmaceuticals, body products, and other toxicants like paint from the paintbrushes that people rinse out in their sinks, how that cocktail affects the ecosystem and our bodies once that treated wastewater is put back into the environment. It's not a new topic in Flagstaff. Using treated wastewater in Snow Bowl for snowmaking has been a very heated issue for years due to the sacredness of the peaks for local tribal communities, right? But the city is also still reluctant to recharge our aquifers with the same treated water. It's an interesting conundrum. And that conundrum of whether to use treated effluent for direct human consumption is known in the water world as the yuck factor, right? We are all facing the yuck factor. What do we do with that water? So while the city is continuing to mull over what to do, whether, over the choice of moving from toilet to tap, as it's called, there are some innovative uses outside the box or outside of the aquifer that the city could employ for both economic growth purposes and for climate resilience. So first, and I just want to point out this picture in the center top shows three different images or three different bottles of water. The one on the left is raw sewage. The one in the center is the effluent at the plant once the solids have been removed. And the one on the right is the reclaimed water. It's been treated. It looks great. Looks like the water that comes out of the tap, right? It looks totally potable. And so through the cleaning process, you can end up with water that is safe to drink from any kind of organic compound. But the question is about those inorganic compounds. Okay, so one of those creative solutions that I found that I think is unique and could function here in Flagstaff is using the water to produce algae. And that algae can be used to produce biofuel. Some scientists at Rice University in Texas have already done this. And in doing this, it actually solves two problems. Since the wastewater already contains a lot of natural free fertilizer, the algae helps to purify the water. Growing algae in the wastewater actually provides this benefit to municipal wastewater treatment plants because it removes nitrates and phosphorus from the water. And currently, it's really hard to do that in a cost-effective way to remove enough of those contaminants from the water. So when you're putting treated effluent back out into, say, Picture Canyon, it's coming along with a lot of nitrates and phosphorus, which can lead to algal blooms in actual live river systems. So I'm going to move on to another solution, but then I'm going to come back to that one with with a pet idea. Oh, can you go back? Yeah. So the other one is something that I found in the state of Oregon, because the state of Oregon is also trying to figure out what to do with all their treated wastewater. They had a competition to see what kind of sustainable uses of wastewater people could come up with. And this one young group of entrepreneurs decided they were going to make beer with it. And, you know, people in Flagstaff, they like to drink beer. So it could be used to expand our community and culture of local breweries, but that would require a special use permit from the city to allow them to use that water, but it is doable. And then as a whitewater kayaker, I'm a proponent of this last suggestion here. What we could do is we could use the water to support a whitewater play park here in town. The algae that we use to clean the water could be then turned into biofuel, and the biofuel could power the whitewater play park, thus using sustainably sourced energy and cleaning water that could then be put back into the environment in an even better state than it comes out of our wastewater treatment facilities. This would create an economic activity new to the city that would be attractive to both locals and to tourists. And after all, you know, this is a river town that doesn't have a river running through it, so this could be a solution to that problem. So in seriousness, it's really worth mentioning that globally, there are several countries that have way less abundant water resources than we do. And that they already employ the policy of using water for potable use. And so the scarcer that water becomes here in Flagstaff due to population growth and climate change, the question of whether we move from toilet to tap is likely not going to be one of if, but when. So it's something that we really need to kind of get over the yuck factor and figure out how to best use this water. And that is all for me, and back to Abe.
Thank you, Danielle. And in an effort to keep hopefully within our time constraints, there are a couple of questions in the chat, Danielle, regarding RNA, regarding the potential land transfer. So if you could read those and get to those, that would be great. Also, Abe just put a link in the chat as well. I'm going to give everybody, and because I want to make sure that everybody has the option for a bio break, I'm going to give everybody 2 minutes to take a quick break, and when we come back, because there aren't any specific metrics, as Abe pointed out, especially regarding cross-jurisdictional type metrics for watershed health, we're going to have a short discussion on what are the metrics, how do we determine the right metrics for this specific watershed plan, then given these metrics, how do we actually do the measuring to determine success of watershed health, or to determine where on the spectrum this watershed is regarding health? So go ahead, if everybody can be back right at 6:40, that would be wonderful. Thank you.